Here are the worst kings of England, starting off with Charles III. I've prepared myself for this moment, so for legal purposes, it's a joke. Here's the real first one, Ethelred the Unready. And judging from his name, you already know he deserves to be mentioned first. Ethelred II took the throne of England in 978. Right from the start, things weren't looking too hot. The Vikings were coming at him like mosquitoes at a barbecue, and Ethelred didn't have a clue how to stop them. Instead of fighting back effectively, he decided to pay them off. Yeah, he just handed over money, thinking that would solve the problem. Not the smartest move, but hey, at least he tried something, right? These Norse invaders kept plaguing England, burning villages and stealing treasures. Instead of organizing a solid defense, Ethelred kept raising taxes to pay the Vikings more money. This strategy backfired big time. The people were fed up with the high taxes, and the Vikings felt encouraged to keep coming back for more. It was a lose-lose situation, but Ethelred seemed too clueless to see it. In 991, Ethelred tried to negotiate peace by paying a hefty sum called Danegeld. This was supposed to keep the Vikings at bay, but guess what? It didn't work. The Vikings just kept coming, demanding more money each time. Ethelred was stuck in a vicious cycle of paying off invaders instead of finding a real solution. Ethelred's marriage to Emma of Normandy in 1002 was supposed to bring some stability. Maybe he thought having a queen from Normandy would help negotiate better with the Vikings. Instead, it just added more complications. Emma wasn't exactly the rock Ethelred needed, and their marriage didn't stop the Viking onslaught. By the early 9th century, things were getting worse. The Vikings, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, were getting bolder. Sweyn was determined to take over England, and Ethelred was too weak to stop him. In 1013, Sweyn invaded and forced Ethelred to flee to Normandy. For a moment, it looked like Ethelred's reign was over. Sweyn took the throne, leaving Ethelred with nothing but a bad reputation. But Ethelred wasn't done yet. The next year, Sweyn died, and Ethelred managed to reclaim the throne. It was a temporary victory, though. The damage had been done during his absence, and the kingdom was in disarray. Ethelred tried to fix things, but years of ineffective leadership had taken their toll. The people were exhausted from the constant wars and high taxes, and trust in their king was at an all-time low. In his final years, Ethelred's grip on power was slipping. The Vikings kept pressuring him, and internal conflicts made governance even harder. By 1016, Ethelred was dead, and his son, Edmund Ironside, took over. The legacy Ethelred left behind was a kingdom weakened by his poor decisions and inability to effectively deal with the Viking threat. It's no wonder history remembers him as unready. He just didn't have the smarts or the guts to lead England out of its troubles. John Lackland. Pretty ironic last name for someone who ruled a massive portion of it. This dude came to the throne in 1199 after his brother, King Richard the Lionheart, went off gallivanting in the Crusades and never returned. From the start, John showed little interest in ruling wisely. He was more interested in drinking and fighting than in managing the kingdom. One of the first things King John did was impose heavy taxes. Farmers, merchants, and even nobles had to cough up more money than they could afford. The people hated it, but John didn't care. He just kept demanding more funds to fund his extravagant lifestyle and failed military campaigns. Justice under King John was another disaster. He was known for being arbitrary and unfair. Courts were more like his personal playground where he could punish people on a whim. If someone crossed him, they were likely to face severe punishment without any real trial. Law and order took a back seat as John did whatever he pleased. It was like living in a place where the principal decided the rules every day, but instead of being strict, he was just plain cruel. Militarily, King John was like what Amber Heard did on Johnny Depp's bed. He struggled to maintain control over his territories in France, which were part of the Angevin Empire. His incompetence on the battlefield led to the loss of these lands, weakening England's position in Europe. His constant need for money led him to exploit his subjects in every way possible. He demanded money for things that didn't need funding, ignored the needs of his people, and acted in his own self-interest. It was as if he saw the kingdom as his personal piggy bank, draining it dry without any consideration for the consequences. The people were fed up, and resentment grew. In 1215, all this discontent boiled over. The barons, who were the nobles supporting the king, had had enough of John's tyranny. They forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that aimed to limit his powers and protect the rights of the nobles and, indirectly, the common people. This was a huge deal because it was one of the first times a king was forced to agree to laws that even he had to follow. The Magna Carta was supposed to bring some relief, But King John was not exactly cooperative. He tried to ignore the document and continued his oppressive ways, leading to a civil war between him and the barons. His inability to adapt or change his ways meant that the problems didn't just disappear with the signing of the Magna Carta. Instead, it led to more conflict. John's reign was also riddled by failed alliances and broken promises. He couldn't keep his word, whether it was with his own barons, foreign allies, or even his family. Trust was non-existent, and everyone knew not to rely on him. King John died the next year, and his kingdom was left in a state that showed how great a leader he was. Stephen of Blois. The usual winning of thrones is when someone dies. That's how Stephen got his rule. Uncle Henry died, so he took it, even though his daughter, Empress Matilda, was supposed to inherit it. This decision kicked off a messy fight for the crown. Stephen wasn't the best and the brightest, and he quickly got into a power struggle with Matilda, who wasn't going to let him have it easy. The fight between Stephen and Matilda flipped the kingdom over, sideways, and under. Both sides built a bunch of castles, turning the countryside into a battlefield. Villages were caught in the middle, suffering from the constant fighting. Stephen moved from castle to castle, trying to keep control, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. His leadership was weak, and he couldn't keep things together. People were tired of the endless wars and just wanted some peace, but Stephen couldn't deliver. During the Anarchy, the country was in total chaos. Law and order took a backseat as everyone was too busy fighting for power. Taxes were collected poorly, if at all, because the king's main focus was on staying in power, not running the kingdom. This neglect led to economic troubles. Farmers couldn't pay their taxes, and trade suffered as roads were unsafe. The economy was in the gutter, and Stephen didn't give a damn. Stephen made alliances that didn't help stabilize his rule. He trusted the wrong people, letting traitors run rampant. His court was filled with self-serving idiots who only looked out for themselves. Decisions were made based on favoritism, not what was best for the kingdom. This nepotism made things worse, as capable leaders were sidelined for those who were just looking to get ahead. The kingdom was run by a bunch of incompetent fools, leading to more problems. The constant fighting drained resources and morale. Soldiers were exhausted, and the common people had had enough of the fighting. Stephen couldn't muster the strength to end the conflict, even when it was clear things were falling apart. His inability to lead effectively meant that the war dragged on, causing more destruction and suffering. It was a never-ending cycle of violence and poor decisions, making life miserable for everyone. Stephen's military strategies were ineffective at best. Battles were lost because his commanders were either incompetent or more interested in their own gain than in winning. Stephen couldn't inspire his troops or make smart decisions on the battlefield. This incompetence led to more losses and weakened his position further. The military was a joke, and Stephen was the punchline, unable to protect his kingdom from falling apart. In 1154, Stephen died without a clear successor, ending his disastrous reign. His death allowed Henry II to take the throne, ending the Anarchy. Richard II of Bordeaux. Richard II took the throne in 1377, when he was just 10 years old, leaving the kingdom to his unprepared advisors. As he grew up, his autocratic style meant that Richard made decisions without consulting anyone else, sidelining the very people who were supposed to help him rule. This created a power vacuum where resentment and frustration could easily build up among the nobles. They started to see him as a tyrant rather than a king, which is quite the achievement if you ask anyone who's tried to boss others around unsuccessfully. Richard's refusal to share power or consider others' opinions led to constant conflicts, making the kingdom unstable. He loved spending money on fancy clothes and lavish feasts while the kingdom struggled with debts. He ignored the pressing issues that needed attention, preferring to indulge in his personal pleasures. The nobles saw this as a sign that he didn't care about the kingdom's well-being. Meanwhile, the commoners were left to deal with high taxes and economic problems, probably wondering why their king was too busy being a fashion icon to fix anything important. It's almost impressive how someone can ignore their responsibilities so thoroughly, but then again, not everyone has it in them. In 1381, a massive uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt shook the kingdom. Richard's inability to address the needs of his people was his downfall. Instead of taking steps to improve conditions, he did nothing, leaving the peasants to take matters into their own hands. The revolt was brutally suppressed, but it showed just how bad of a ruler he was. By the late 1990s, discontent had reached a boiling point. Henry Bolingbroke, a powerful noble, returned from exile to reclaim his inheritance, which Richard had seized. This move was the final straw for many who were already fed up with Richard's rule. Henry gathered support from disgruntled nobles and marched against the king. Richard was unprepared for the rebellion as always. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke successfully overthrew Richard II. forcing him to resign from his position. Harold Godwinson. King Harold Godwinson became King of England in 1066 after the death of Edward the Confessor. His rise to power was quick and not without controversy, as some thought he wasn't the best choice for the job. Harold was part of a powerful family, which helped him grab the throne, but that also meant he had plenty of enemies ready to tear him down. Once Harold took the crown, he had to deal with several challenges. First, there were threats from other claimants to the throne. William of Normandy, who claimed that Harold had promised him the crown, wasn't too happy about Harold sitting on the throne. Then there was Harald Hardrada of Norway, who also thought he had a right to be king. Managing these threats was no easy task, and Harold had to keep his army ready for action. In September of that same year, Harald Hardrada invaded northern England. Harold had to leave his family and secure the north, which was a tough job. He fought Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where his forces won but not without heavy losses. This battle showed that Harold's leadership had its flaws. He rushed his troops into battle, and many good soldiers were lost. It wasn't exactly the smartest move, but it's not like we expected too much from Harold. After dealing with Hardrada, Harold had barely any time to rest before William of Normandy landed in the south. Harold had to march his exhausted army all the way down to face William's forces. This was no small feat, considering his men were tired and hungry. The march took a toll on his army, and by the time they met William's troops at the Battle of Hastings, they were not in the best shape. The Battle of Hastings was brutal. Harold's army was beaten by William's Normans, who had better tactics and more resources. Harold himself was killed in the battle, and so it was the end of his short and troubled reign. Some blame Harold's poor decisions and leadership for the defeat. Henry Tudor. King Henry VIII became King of England in 1509. He was married to Catherine of Aragon first. They were supposed to have one child, but only one daughter, Mary, was born. Henry was not happy because he wanted a son to continue his family line. He got tired of waiting and decided to divorce Catherine, even though the church said no. Henry wanted to have more power over the church, so he started the Church of England. Henry married his second wife, Anne Boleyn, hoping she would give him a son. Instead, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne was accused of not being a good wife and was executed. Henry did not care much about fairness. He just wanted to do what he wanted. He then married Jane Seymour, who finally gave him a son, Edward. But Jane died shortly after childbirth, which didn't make Henry any happier. After Jane died, Henry married 3 more times. Each marriage ended badly. He divorced or had his wives executed if they didn't produce a male heir. He married Anne of Cleves but found her too ugly for him and ended the marriage as fast as possible. Then he married Catherine Howard, who was much younger, but she was caught cheating and was executed too. His last wife was Catherine Parr, who outlived him. Henry was known for being very controlling and ruthless. He did not hesitate to execute people who opposed him, including 2 of his wives. Many of his subjects lived in fear because of his harsh rule. He also wasted a lot of money on his lavish lifestyle and building projects, which left the country in debt. During his reign, Henry made significant changes to the government and the church, but his methods were often brutal. He broke away from the Catholic Church and established himself as the head of the Church of England. This led to the persecution of many religious leaders and the dissolution of monasteries, where many monks and nuns were forced to leave or were killed. Henry VI. Henry VI. King Henry VI became king when he was just a baby in 1422, after his father, Henry V, died. This little kid had a lot on his plate and he ate nothing. His reign started strong, but things went downhill fast. When Henry was a baby, his uncle acted as his guardian. As he grew up, people realized he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He was supposed to rule England, but his weak leadership made everything worse. By the time Henry VI was old enough to rule on his own, England was already having problems. The 100 Years' War with France was dragging on, and England wasn't winning like they used to. Henry couldn't lead the army properly, which annoyed everyone. His inability to make strong decisions let his advisors take control, and they weren't doing a great job either. The people were getting restless, and the nobles were starting to fight among themselves. Henry's reign was marked by a lot of peace and calm, which was not exactly what England needed during tough times. While he was too busy being nice and not causing any trouble, powerful nobles were gaining more influence. These nobles were the real bosses, making decisions that Henry should have been making. It was like having a puppet king, and the nobles were pulling the strings. This lack of control led to more chaos and dissatisfaction among the people. In 1455, things got really bad with the start of the Wars of the Roses. This was a series of civil wars between 2 rival branches of the royal family, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Henry VI was a Lancaster, and his weak rule made it easy for the Yorks to challenge him. The wars were brutal and caused a lot of suffering. Families were torn apart, and the country was plunged into constant fighting. Henry couldn't unite the kingdom or keep the peace, which only made the wars last longer. Henry was also fickle-minded and weak-willed. He suffered from bouts of madness, which made it impossible for him to rule effectively. During these episodes, he couldn't make important decisions, and the government fell apart. The nobles used his illness as an excuse to fight for power, and that crippled the already amputated country even more. In 1461, Richard, Duke of York, took advantage of the chaos and claimed the throne. Henry was deposed and went into exile. This was a huge blow to the Lancasters, and it showed just how weak Henry's rule had become. The Yorks took over, but the fighting didn't stop. Instead, it just continued with different leaders. Henry was briefly restored to the throne in 1470, but his return didn't bring any stability. The Yorks were still a threat, and the kingdom remained divided. Henry's second reign was short-lived. In 1471, he was finally overthrown by Edward IV, a Yorkist. Henry was captured and imprisoned. What a chump! William Rufus. King William II took the throne of England in 1087 after his father, William the Conqueror, died. Right from the start, his reign was anything but smooth. He didn't get along with the church, which was a big deal back then. William had constant arguments with Archbishop Anselm, making church leaders really unhappy. People in the church thought William was a tool, always pushing his own agenda instead of listening to what they had to say. On top of that, the nobility had a lot of beef with him too. Lords and barons didn't like how William ran things. They felt like he was stepping on their toes and not respecting their power. Some of them even rebelled against him, which is a clear sign that his rule was seriously flawed. Managing the nobility is no joke, and William seemed to handle it like a bull in a china shop, causing more problems instead of solving them. This constant tension made his kingdom unstable, and everyone around him was just waiting for the next screw-up. William wasn't the only one making waves. His relationship with his own family wasn't great either. His younger brother, Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux, was especially troublesome. Odo tried to undermine William's authority whenever he could, which only added to the chaos. Money troubles were another headache for William. He needed funds to maintain his army and keep the nobles in line, so he kept raising taxes. Naturally, people hated this. Raising taxes is never popular, and doing it repeatedly made William even more unpopular. The commoners were already struggling, and now they had to deal with even higher taxes, which didn't exactly earn him any friends. It's hard to stay on top when everyone is angry and unhappy with your decisions. William's hunting habits were infamous. He loved hunting so much that it often took him away from his royal duties. This obsession with hunting distracted him from governing effectively. While he was out in the woods, the kingdom was left in shambles. The end of William's reign was as messy as the rest of his rule. In 1100, he died under mysterious circumstances while hunting in the New Forest. Officially, it was said that an arrow accidentally hit him, but many people suspected foul play. Theories suggested that his brother-in-law, Henry de Bohun, might have had a hand in his death. If that's true, it means William was assassinated. James II. He became King of England in 1685. He was a Catholic, which was a big problem in a mostly Protestant country. James tried to make things better for Catholics. He thought everyone should be allowed to follow their own religion, even Catholics. This made a lot of Protestants angry. They saw James as a threat to their beliefs. James started by letting Catholics hold important jobs in the government and the army. This was a big deal, because before, Protestants had most of the power. James thought it was fair to give Catholics a chance too. But many people didn't like this change. They thought Catholics were trying to take over England. In 1687, James issued the Declaration of Indulgence. This document was supposed to allow people to practice Catholicism and other religions freely, but Protestants saw this as James trying to make Catholicism the official religion. They thought he was pushing his own agenda and undermining the Protestant Church. James also tried to repeal the Test Acts. These were laws that required people in certain jobs to be Protestant. Repealing them would allow Catholics to hold these positions. This move was seen as James favoring Catholics over Protestants. It didn't sit well with many, especially those who feared losing their jobs to Catholics. I've seen this before, just in Germany and against Jews. The birth of James's son in 1688 was another big issue. Before that, the throne was expected to go to his Protestant daughter, Mary. But with a son, James could establish a Catholic dynasty. This scared the Protestant leaders. They didn't want a line of Catholic kings and queens ruling England. It made them take action against James. Opposition grew, and Protestant leaders invited William of Orange, a Protestant, to invade England. William landed with his army, and many soldiers switched sides when they saw James was losing support. This quick turn of events showed how unpopular James had become. James tried to fight back, but couldn't muster enough support. His own army didn't back him, and the people were ready for a change. In 1688, James fled to France. This event is known as the Glorious Revolution. It was called glorious because it happened without a big battle, and James was forced into exile. He never returned to England, leaving his throne to William and Mary. Charles I. Finally, a Charles. King Charles I became king in 1625. Right from the start, he wanted to rule without sharing power. He didn't like talking to Parliament, which was supposed to help make decisions. Instead, he made his own rules and didn't listen to others. This made people frustrated because they had no say in how the country was run. Charles was stubborn and thought he knew best, ignoring the opinions of his advisors and the people. Charles tried to raise money without asking Parliament for help. He imposed taxes that were unfair and made everyone pay up or face consequences. People thought he was greedy and only cared about his own wealth. He also used soldiers to enforce his rules, which scared many. His methods were heavy-handed and showed he didn't care about fairness. This kind of bossy behavior made him really unpopular with both the nobles and regular folks. Religion was another big mess during his reign. Charles wanted everyone to follow the Church of England strictly. He didn't tolerate other religions and forced people to attend church services he approved of. This pissed off Puritans and other religious groups who wanted more freedom to worship differently. Charles's harsh stance on religion created tension and division in the country. People were tired of his attempts to control their beliefs and practices. In 1629, after years of arguing and fighting with Parliament over taxes and power, Charles decided to shut it down for 11 years. This period is known as the personal rule. Without Parliament, Charles had no one to check his decisions, so he made even more unpopular choices. He ruled alone, ignoring the needs and voices of the people. This only made his reign more despised and set the stage for bigger conflicts later on. Charles's poor leadership led to increased debt and economic problems. He spent a lot of money on wars and his lavish lifestyle, which drained the country's resources. People were already struggling with taxes, and his irresponsible spending made things worse. The economy suffered, and many blamed Charles for not managing the finances properly. His inability to handle money issues showed just how out of touch he was with his subjects' hardships. In 1640, Charles had to call Parliament back because the country was in financial trouble. Parliament wasn't happy to be back and had a lot of grievances against him. They criticized his autocratic style and demanded more power to make decisions. The tension between Charles and Parliament grew, leading to confrontations and a breakdown in their relationship. Neither side was willing to compromise, which made the situation worse. The conflict between the king and Parliament escalated into the English Civil War in 1642. Charles led the Royalists, who supported his right to rule, while Parliament supported the parliamentarians, who wanted more say in governance. The war was brutal and divided the country. During the war, Charles made several poor choices that weakened his position. He underestimated the strength and determination of the parliamentarians and overestimated his own support. His leadership was ineffective, and his strategies often failed. This incompetence on the battlefield further damaged his reputation and support. The more he lost, the more people saw him as a failed king. In 1646, Charles was captured by the parliamentarians. Instead of being treated fairly, he was held prisoner. The parliamentarians were determined to hold him accountable for the chaos he caused. They put him on trial for high treason, accusing him of betraying the country. The trial was a big deal because it was rare for a king to be tried like a common criminal. It showed just how much people wanted to see him removed from power. Charles didn't accept the verdict and continued to fight until 1649. Despite his efforts, he couldn't change the outcome. The parliamentarians sentenced him to death, and in January 1649, King Charles I was executed. Shocked no one? Well, it shocked everyone because he was the first king to have his head separated from the rest of his body. So what did we learn from these kings? Simple. Win the throne, tax the people, spend a lot, be a bad person, do bad in battles, die or get exiled or get executed. See y'all.